following on from making the Northern Finescale wagon kits and painting it and showing how to do the transfers, I thought it might be a good idea to make a video about how to do a more complicated private owner livery. The Abbott livery was I chose because it was plain black and quick and easy to paint. So for the basic build demonstrations, I thought this would be a good way of doing something a bit more complicated which you can add on to that as a follow-up. I've got another Northern Finescale wagon body. I've painted it, I've primed it, exactly the same as the last video. It's identical to the last video, and what we're going to do is make this into a Pugh & Co wagon. Hornby Railways made a rather nice rendition of this in the 80s. I've got a couple of them somewhere, but I can't find them, would you believe? So that's what we're going to do with this. The basic premise of it is you've got all this strapping detail which would have been picked out in black. The rest of the wagon was red, sort of brick red. We'll come on to that later. The strapping is, you have two options for painting the strapping. You could spray the whole model red and pick it out in black, but the trouble with this is you're trying to paint over something that is raised, and it's very easy to spill the paint off the edge a bit. An alternative is to do what I'm going to show you how to do, which in a true Blue Peter fashion, one I've already done earlier. Here's another one. Spray the whole model black, which then takes care of the strapping and the detail. It's all done then, you don't have to worry about it. And then this is a humble acrylic matte black, incidentally, and then use a humble acrylic red to paint the rest of the model. I have chosen to use it's recommended you use a brick red. I'm using EWS matte red. It looks more like the Hornby model, which of course could be wrong, but it looks, if it looks right, it generally is. It's just a nicer red. It's sort of in between the recommended brick red and the bright red of the Hornby, and it looks about right to my eye anyway. So that's what we're going to use. So I'll get the workbench in position and then we'll get on and do it. Okay, the matte black spray finish has dried, which gives us a base to paint our model with. Now I'm using a humble acrylic paint because this is acrylic paint, and just to make it less likely to have a reaction, I'm using the same kind of paint on top of the same kind of paint. And I'm using humble acrylic RC418, which is a railway colour in the humble range. It's actually EWS red. The humble used to have a very large railway colours range back in the old days, and they seem to have reinvigorated that and started doing them again, all modern equivalents. This paint's rather good because it has a screw cap, so it's quite easy to get into and out of. I've already stirred this, so this is ready to go, but make sure you give it a good stir before you use it. Because it's I'm using a matte finish paint to allow quicker drying time between coats, because it's going to take about 3 or 4 coats to do this, because unfortunately that's just the way it goes. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see exactly what I'm doing. There we go. Okay, so this stuff needs a good stir. It generally works better once it's been opened for a little while. I find you'll end up with a very runny sort of paint to start with, but once it's been used for 2 or 3 times, the paint goes off a little bit in the tin or in the pot, sorry, and it goes on a little bit easier. So basically, all you've got to do is treat it as separate panels. So this will be a panel, and this will be a panel, and the doors, and so on and so on. And then that way you can break it down and just make it a little bit easier to paint, because otherwise you're going to end up with end up with just a large job. It's easier if you break it down into a series of smaller stages. It's probably going to take it's going to take 2 or 3 coats of this paint, I reckon. So where you come up to the strapping, just load the brush and just run up the edge of the strapping. It's easier to paint adjacent to a raised detail than it is to try and paint onto the detail. You could spray the whole model. Well, there's 2 ways of doing this really. You could spray the model with the red, or you could, and then pick out all the strapping detail in black, which is quite fiddly, especially if you've got poor eyesight or unsteady hands. I would certainly have a go at doing it this way, but this is the way Northern Finescale recommend you do it, and it does work rather well, so it's not really too much of a chore to do. What I'll do is I'll paint a panel, let it dry, and then let you see what it looks like after 2 or 3 coats. I won't paint the whole model on camera because it will just take too long. And it does take a little while to do, especially with all the different coats. But as you can see, it's just a case of just taking your time with it. Just be very careful. There's no need to rush this. If you rush it, you're going to make a mistake, and the strapping detail is going to get paint on it. There we go. And of course, this method works rather well in the smaller scales as well, because you've got it's much harder in the smaller scales to pick out strapping detail because it's that much smaller. It's hard enough in this size. And you're never going to get a flat finish with this. Unless you sprayed the red, you're always going to end up with a bit of a brushed effect, which I suppose you could argue it will show up next to wagons which have been sprayed. But if you've weathered the wagon, it will blend it all in to a certain extent anyway. And there you go, that's a panel. And as you can see, it doesn't take too long to do, and the paint does dry very quickly. So you will end up being able to do this fairly fast. Obviously, it depends on the ambient temperature. If you're in a cold room, or even if in a hot room, if you're in a warm room, it's going to dry even faster than what it is now. Just treat it as a series of stages, and just chill out. Put the radio on, do it in front of the telly, do it in front of Corrie, and then that way it becomes less of a chore then, especially if you've got a few of these to do. I've actually got another wagon to do after this. I've got 2 of these, and there's a couple of afternoons just in the painting really, but that's all part of the fun. It's a little bit trickier in certain areas, but with the first coat, don't worry too much if it looks a bit sort of, the colouring's all over the place, it looks a bit like there's black showing through. You're not going to get perfect coverage first time. This is why we have 2 or 3 coats. And it's only on the third coat that you'll really start to see it come together. It does help if you're able to turn the model to get it to into different orientations. Obviously your hand can only get into certain areas. Okay, right, so I'm going to turn it again. And I can come up against that bit of strapping now. Okay. There we go, there's 2 panels worth done. In a minute I'll cut back to when it's dry and you can see me putting a second coat on to one or both of them, and you can see the difference it makes. Okay, so the paint's had a chance to go off. I've left a couple of panels, sorry, with only 1 coat on, just to show you the difference in how coat the paint can make. These 2 here have had 2 coats, I'm going to put a 3rd one on. This one's only had 1, so you can see the difference between fills in terms of how well the paint covers. So I'm going to get on and put another coat on here and then across the whole thing, and then you'll see what the finished product looks like. Okay, here are the results after 3 coats of the EWS Humbrol acrylic. As you can see, the strapping has been neatly defined. The colour has filled out quite nicely as well. It takes 3 or 4 coats, I'm afraid, depending on the colour shades, to get the finished result, I'm afraid. But fortunately, because I've used a matte shade, which interestingly hasn't dried matte, it's dried as satin, but that's how it goes. It dries quite quickly, especially as it's water-based, because it's acrylic. So it doesn't actually, depending on temperature, ambient temperature, take too long to dry off, which is good. There's a little bit of overspill, just a little bit just there, and just like around in little odd areas where I've gone a little bit over the strapping detail on the hinges. I'm going to overtouch that later on with some Humbrol matte black acrylic brush paint, which will help disguise that. But that's more or less ready for transfers now, and I haven't actually done the transfers on the model yet, so I will, on either side, so I will do those. I won't show you me doing those because I've already shown you doing them in the previous video, and I will cut back to this once it is finished. Okay, the wagon is more or less painted now, and it's just a case of touching it in now, and I'm using just some Humbrol black enamel, matte black enamel, to touch in where I've over crept onto the strapping with the brown. You should use acrylic really, you shouldn't really be mixing up paints, but I don't have any matte black acrylic, so in a brush pot anyway, so I'm going to just touch in with this. It'll be okay, enamel over acrylic is fine, it's the other way around, you start getting problems. But just very carefully, just have a good look at what you've done, and just very carefully, just, you don't have to go mad putting loads on, you only just enough to sort of tone it down a bit, because it's going to be weathered anyway, so with this particular wagon, so I'm not going to go too crazy with it. Use the smallest brush you've got or you can get, and that will help with the getting the paint on. I find also that if you turn it so that you're coming at the paint in that sort of direction, it becomes easier to stay on the line. There we go. I mean, don't go, don't worry too much if you miss a bit. When certainly out in someone's garden, when it's tearing around behind in a freight train, no one's going to point at it and go, "Oh, you missed a bit there." But obviously, if it's a layout model and it's going to be moved around at quite slow speeds, then it's becomes a bit more important then. But the thing to do is just always try and do as best a job you can on everything, and then that way you get a nice standard finish. And there's just one little bit left. You might have to, I mean, you might creep over with the black, and you have to go back and touch in a bit more brown, but that's no hardship really. There we go. I think that's it. There's a little bit at the bottom I need to do. Let's just zoom out a touch. By their nature, I mean, private owned vehicles, there's a bit more to painting them. They are quite a bit more fiddly than just a standard liveried, sort of plain liveried mainline company vehicle, but it's all part of the fun. Okay, right, that's it. I'll put the transfers on now once that's gone off, and you can see the finished result. You might notice on the inside I've painted the planking, but only with the body colour, but only down as far as 2 planks. This is going to be filled with a coal load, and I just wanted to give enough depth to, where if I don't get the coal load quite high enough, I wanted to be able to get enough relief just to make it look like the inside was painted. So that's what I've done. Oh, there's a bit I've missed. Just paint the top of the end straps. There we go, right. I will let that dry, put the transfers on, and then you can see how I've done. Well, I hope, but we shall see. Okay, and here is the model well on its way to completion. I've put some ballast weights in it, the transfers are on, I've painted the wheels, I haven't put the buffers on yet, but it's getting there. I've started to weather it, just to show how easily it can be done. Quite a few more transfers on this one than the Abbott one, but they went on pretty well, and it's well on the way to being quite a nice model, and I'm quite looking forward to using this one. But I hope it shows how simply it can be done, and I hope it inspires you to have a go.